building a strong connection with Allah the Almighty. Building a strong connection with Allah the Almighty. That is the reason we have been sent to this world. That is our ultimate reason for ending up on this earth. Building a strong connection with Allah the Almighty. Doing everything that He tells us to do. Acting upon the commands of Allah the Almighty. Staying away from His prohibitions. Acknowledging to His greatness. That Allah the Almighty is the greatest. Allah the Almighty is the best. There is nothing better, there is no one better than Allah the Almighty. He is the King of all kings. He is the Master of all masters. He is the Manager of all managers. We all know that Allah the Almighty is the greatest. We all believe this because we are Muslims, because we are mu'mins, we are believers. However, making this sink into our hearts and minds, making this resonate into our hearts and minds is something that we need to do so that it helps us in our lives, so that we live as true Muslims, so that we live as true believers. Many of us will go through tough and testing times, but because the true recognition of Allah the Almighty, His greatness, His loftiness has not resonated in our hearts and minds, so we forget Allah at testing times. But if the true recognition of Allah the Almighty, it resonates in our hearts and minds, then no matter what situation we face in our life, we may face the most testing of times, but because Allah the Almighty is truly entrenched in our hearts, in our minds, because Allah the Almighty is deeply rooted in our hearts and minds, and because we have that deep connection with Him, we know that these tests are from Allah the Almighty. We start remembering those verses in the Quran where Allah the Almighty reminds us that this life is a test. That you will be tested in different ways. You may be tested through your wealth. You may be tested through your health. You may be tested through your children. You may be tested in different ways. Only because Allah the Almighty wants you to become closer to Him. Only so that you get closer to Allah the Almighty. So that Allah the Almighty forgives your sins. And so that Allah the Almighty, He raises your ranks. We remember these verses at such testing times if Allah the Almighty has truly resonated in our hearts and minds. If we have that true and deep connection with Allah the Almighty. And this deep connection with Allah the Almighty is something that is needed in our lives. Because we may face times in our lives where we go through testing times, where we think we cannot talk to anyone else. But if we have that deep connection, if we have that strong connection with Allah the Almighty, we know we can communicate with Him. Sometimes we may feel that we cannot talk to someone because others are not going through the same situation that we are going through. But if we have that deep connection with Allah the Almighty, if we have that strong connection with Allah the Almighty, we know we can communicate with Him. We know we can talk to Him. We know we could pray to Him. We know we could ask from Him. Because it is Him and it is He who helps us in difficult times. It is He who feeds us when we are hungry. It is He who gives us drink and who quenches our thirst when we are thirsty. It is He who guides us when we are misguided. And we truly need that strong connection with Allah the Almighty, that deep connection with Allah the Almighty, because this is the ultimate reason we have been sent to this world. We have been sent because of Allah, so we need to live for Him. And when we truly recognize Allah, His greatness, it resonates in our hearts and minds, then no matter what we do in life, whether it's acts of worship, whether it's when we go outside, whether it's social dealings, then we have Allah the Almighty on the forefront of our minds, and we do everything according to His happiness. If we are married and we are talking with our spouse, for example, then we know that our spouse is a human, is a creation from Allah the Almighty. Our spouse has feelings, our spouse has emotions, and Allah the Almighty is looking at what we are doing, so we need to fulfill the rights of our spouse. we need to speak in a decent manner. We don't need to be abusive. We don't need to be oppressive, because this is not what Allah the Almighty likes. This is not what Allah the Almighty is happy with. Likewise, if we have children, then we need to be compassionate. We need to be merciful. Yes, we can reprimand them, but within the boundaries of Sharia. And within this thought where we have that Allah the Almighty is watching us, so we need to make sure we do things according to His happiness. If we are children and we have parents, then we need to make sure that we do not raise our voices in front of our parents. We need to make sure that we are respectful. We conduct our affairs with them in a dignified and respectful manner, because Allah the Almighty is watching us. If we understand and we have this recognition of Allah deeply rooted in our hearts and minds, then we will know at such times that we have to respect our parents. Likewise, when we are talking with any human being outside, whether it's a Muslim or a non-Muslim, we know that this is a creation of Allah. This is someone that has emotions, someone that has feelings, so we need to keep them happy. We need to speak to them in a respectful way. Likewise, if we see animals as well, these are creation of Allah, and Allah the Almighty will only be happy if we conduct our affairs with other creation of Allah the Almighty in a good, dignified and respectful way, in a way that Allah the Almighty is always happy with us. If we look into the lives of our pious predecessors, then we find that the recognition of Allah the Almighty was deeply rooted in their hearts and minds, to such an extent that not just in acts of worship, but even when they used to do business, because they had Allah the Almighty at the forefront of their minds, they deeply remembered Allah and they did everything for the sake of Allah. For example, we have the likes of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, a great Imam who left many lessons for us from his life, who left so much knowledge for us behind, that many of us follow his footsteps, many of us act upon his narrations, etc. Now, as we all know, he was a businessman. He was a businessman that used to deal with cloth. And in those times, they never used to have lights such as what we have in this day and age. So whenever they used to close their shops, they would close their shops when it used to get dark outside, more specifically at Maghrib time, when the sun used to set. Nowadays, we can leave our shops open until late night because we have lights. But in those days, they never used to have lights as such. So they used to close their shops at Maghrib time, more specifically, when it used to get dark outside. Upon one occasion, Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he was closing his shop at Zohr time. Someone asked him, "What are you doing? Why are you closing your shop at Zohr time? It's so early. It's not even Maghrib time yet." So Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he replied by saying, "Look at the sky. Look, it is very cloudy. And because of it being very cloudy, it is very dark outside. Now, I do not want someone coming to my shop in this state where it is dark, there is not much light, and a person comes to buy cloth. He looks at the cloth, he sees the cloth, and he is tricked into buying something that he is not aware of because of there being a shortage of light. Hence, I am closing my shop at Zohr time today because it's very cloudy. I do not want anyone to be tricked into buying something that they are not aware of because of the shortage of light." So Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, on that specific day, he closed his shop at Zohr time. We can learn a great lesson from this, that Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he didn't care about the money. What did he care about? He cared about the opposing person that's coming to buy the cloth, which is a creation of Allah. And because Allah the Almighty was deeply rooted in Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah's heart and mind, and he had this true deep recognition of Allah the Almighty, he understood that he need to fulfill others' rights as well. And it wasn't just all about the money, it was about fulfilling other people's rights. It's about keeping others happy for the sake of Allah the Almighty. So if we deeply have this recognition of Allah rooted into our hearts and minds, then no matter what we are doing in life, we do it for the sake of Allah the Almighty. Whether it's in acts of worship, whether it's outside in social dealings, whether it's when we are working, with Muslims, non-Muslims, whatever we are doing is for the sake of Allah the Almighty, but we will only do it for the sake of Allah the Almighty if we have Him deeply rooted in our hearts and minds, and we deeply recognize that Allah the Almighty is the greatest. It is because of Him we have been sent to this world, so we need to live truly for Him. I pray Allah the Almighty give us the ability to understand what has been mentioned. I pray Allah the Almighty give us the ability to deeply recognize that He is the greatest and we need to do everything for Him. And I pray Allah the Almighty give us the ability to act upon everything that has been said. I mean,